HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Covert Action, Reagan, the CIA, and the Cold War Struggle in Poland, by Seth G. Jones. Read by Jonathan Yen. The Lord will give strength unto his people. Psalms, chapter 29, verse 11. Inscribed on a monument at the Gdansk shipyard in memory of those workers killed by Polish forces in December 1970. Prologue. In the slanting light of Maryland's Catoctin mountain ridge, President Ronald Reagan stepped outside his cottage for a morning walk. It was December 12, 1981. The air was crisp and dry at Camp David. The temperature had dipped to freezing overnight, chilly for the former California governor. A thin layer of frost clung gently to the window panes at the presidential retreat 60 miles northwest of Washington. Reagan relished his walks at Camp David. It was great to be in a house with the knowledge you could just open a door and take a walk outdoors if you wanted, he recalled. On some days, Reagan preferred to ride horses. A few months before, on a gusty October morning, he slipped out a back gate into the National Forest and guided his horse to the stone ruin of Valley View Manor, a once gallant summer hotel. For Reagan, Camp David provided solace from the oppressive pace of work and visitors back in Washington. That is precisely what President Franklin D. Roosevelt had in mind when he converted a campground for government employees and their families into a presidential retreat in 1942. Roosevelt named Camp David Shangri-La, the mythical utopia described by British author James Hilton in the 1933 novel Lost Horizon. The location was attractive for its seclusion. But Camp David wasn't lavish. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had allegedly quipped that Camp David was, in principle, a log cabin. Roosevelt had named the Aspen Lodge, where Reagan stayed, the Bear's Den. It had a quaint kitchen and a comfortable living room with stuffed furniture, where Reagan liked to relax in an easy chair with his spit-polished shoes, or cowboy boots, perched atop a footstool. He and his wife, Nancy, would curl up there and watch movies. The African Queen, starring Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart, North by Northwest with Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint, and Yankee Doodle Dandy with the indomitable James Cagney. Aspen Lodge was situated atop a hill, and the living room's oversized windows offered a magnificent view of Catoctin Mountain Park and the valley below. Reagan briefly paused outside his door and soaked in the morning's tranquility. When he came to the White House in 1981, Reagan had embodied the raw optimism of Roosevelt and the small-town charm of Dwight Eisenhower, both of whom he admired. After being struck by an assassin's bullet and losing over half his blood on March 30th, 1981, Reagan's display of valor further endeared him to Americans. "Honey, I forgot to duck," he had whispered to Nancy, almost apologetically, shortly before he was wheeled into the operating room at George Washington University Hospital. After surviving the assassination attempt, Reagan faced a growing series of crises at home and abroad. Roughly 13,000 air traffic controllers went on strike, threatening to shut down air travel in the United States. Overseas, Israeli forces launched periodic strikes into Lebanon as Reagan attempted to mediate an escalating crisis involving Israel, Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Lebanese militias. Back at Camp David, Reagan finished his walk and, feeling buoyant, returned to Aspen Lodge. At 12:10 p.m. that afternoon, he phoned the evangelist Billy Graham, a close friend, but couldn't get through. He spent the afternoon at his desk, reviewing paperwork. It was peaceful at Camp David. An hour-and-a-half drive to the southeast, CIA leadership was in a frenzy. At their headquarters in McLean, Virginia, CIA analysts had been monitoring events in Poland. They were scrambling to determine whether the Polish government, with Soviet support, was about to declare martial law. CIA Director William Bill Casey realized that martial law, if enacted, meant that the Polish military would take charge of the country in an effort to crush Solidarity, Poland's flowering democratic movement. With new emergency powers, the government would likely send tanks into the streets, take over radio and television stations, and round up Solidarity members. A direct confrontation on the edge of Eastern Europe between the forces of democracy and totalitarianism would trigger one of the most serious crises of the Cold War. The Soviets were putting tremendous pressure on Polish Prime Minister Wojciech Jaruzelski to act. The grassroots opposition movement, led by Solidarity, was potentially catastrophic for the Soviets. One CIA estimate said, "Poland presents the USSR with the most threatening and complex challenge to its vital interests to emerge in the post-war period." The week before, a top-secret CIA report had concluded that the Polish government has completed its plans for imposing martial law, and some recent activity is consistent with the final preparations that would precede the implementation of such plans. The document also judged that the Soviet Union was making simultaneous preparations to deploy Red Army forces for a possible intervention in Poland, much like they had done in Czechoslovakia in August 1968, when Soviet forces quashed the political reform movement led by Alexander Dubček. On the evening of December 12th, word reached CIA headquarters that the Polish government had cut telephone communications between Poland and the West and closed the Polish border. The CIA sent out an alert to analysts assigned to the crisis, most of whom were comfortably at home on a Saturday night. Sensing the magnitude of the situation, CIA officials dashed back to headquarters and congregated in the operations center. CIA Director Casey and his executive assistant attended the meeting, as did the director and deputy director of the operations center. Casey took his seat at the table. With drooping jowls, stooped physique, and heavy-rimmed glasses, Casey was easily the most powerful CIA director in a generation. He was an indefatigable opponent of communism, determined to bloody Soviet noses around the globe. The group debated how to interpret the events, and whether, and how, to report them to the White House. Some argued that it might be just another localized crackdown, several of which had occurred in recent days. Others guessed that it could be the beginning of a full government takeover. Shortly after midnight in Washington and 6 a.m. in Poland on December 13th, one CIA analyst left to see whether there were intelligence updates that had come in by classified cables from the CIA station in Warsaw. He soon returned and silenced the room. Jaruzelski had just announced martial law. Washington and Moscow were now on a collision course in Poland. Anxiety blanketed Warsaw like a thick fog, creeping into the city's neighborhoods, churches, and marketplaces. All week, Poland's state-controlled television had broadcast apocalyptic tales depicting Poland as a country on the verge of collapse, a propaganda blitz that disquieted even pro-government sycophants. One television commentator described a mood of insurrection and tension. Appearing on Polish television at 6 a.m. on December 13th, against the backdrop of the red and white Polish flag emblazoned with a coat of arms, Jaruzelski addressed the nation. He appeared stiff and formal in front of the camera, wearing a pressed olive-green military uniform with 11 neat rows of ribbons on his chest. With his chin thrust upward from his hollow face and thinning hair, Jaruzelski parsed his words carefully. "Our homeland is at the edge of an abyss," he said, his voice flat and his face nervously glancing down at his prepared notes. "The achievements of many generations and the Polish home that has been built up from the dust are about to turn into ruins. State structures are ceasing to function. Each day delivers new blows to the waning economy." Poland was sitting on the verge of Armageddon, he explained. Strikes, strike alerts, protests have become standard. Even students are dragged into it. There are more and more examples of terror, threats, mob trials, and direct coercion. Crimes, robberies, and break-ins are spreading like a wave through the country. He then uttered the words that would earn him a villainous place in Polish history. "I declare that today the Military Council of National Salvation has been formed. In accordance with the Constitution, the State Council has imposed martial law all over the country," he said. Jaruzelski concluded his speech by reciting the opening lines of the Polish national anthem. "Poland has not yet perished, so long as we still live." The television image of Jaruzelski declaring martial law would be burned into the memories of Poles. The decision unleashed a series of dramatic events, from the arrests and beatings of Solidarity members to massive street protests and riots, that significantly reshaped Poland's history. The declaration of martial law was not entirely surprising. It had been widely rumored that Polish and Soviet officials had been planning martial law. A secret document later revealed that the Polish Ministry of Internal Affairs had been considering such an approach for several months. Though the document outlined alternative strategies to suppress Solidarity, the objective was straightforward: to discipline society and reinforce the execution of power. The classified document also foresaw the countervailing actions Solidarity supporters might take, like mass strikes, sabotage operations, and street demonstrations. Polish officials had decided to act by early December. In secret negotiations with the Soviets, General Florian Siewicki, chief of the Polish General Staff, told his Soviet counterparts, "The enemy has said his final word. The sides have clearly staked out their positions." In classic, overblown Marxist prose, Siewicki continued, "Now what is needed is a resolute struggle against the counter-revolution." Polish officials referred to Solidarity as the counter-revolutionaries, who were bent on sowing destruction and disorder. For many Poles, martial law was an affront to their freedom, but they had little recourse. Bowing to Soviet pressure, the Polish government sent soldiers into the streets in the early morning hours of December 13th. Neighbors were aroused by the dreadful sound of crowbars smashing windows and doors as Polish forces began arresting members of Solidarity and carrying them off to internment camps. All gatherings, processions, and demonstrations, except for religious services, were now banned in Poland. All trade unions and student organizations were suspended. All mail and telephone communications were censored. The government imposed a curfew, and everyone over the age of 13 had to carry an identity card. Poland was now sealed off from the outside world. Martial law was the beginning of a long, tortuous journey for Lech Wałęsa, Solidarity's leader, who was arrested along with scores of others. Born in 1943, Lech Wałęsa was an improbable figure to lead Eastern Europe's most audacious dissident movement. He was a shipyard worker who was proudly, if not disdainfully, anti-intellectual, claiming that he had never read a serious book in his life. But he had a gift for public speaking. When he expounded the struggles of the dock workers and union laborers, electrified crowds thronged to hear him, flashing their traditional solidarity V sign for victory. He could also move effortlessly between roles. Wałęsa is not one, but 10 men. Solidarity leader, electrician, father, husband, actor, negotiator, and more, remarked Adam Michnik, a Polish writer and solidarity activist. He's a worker, with intellectuals around him. He's very nationalistic without being chauvinistic, very Catholic without being clerical, a kind of Polish synthesis. For Wałęsa, solidarity was as much an ideological struggle about freedom and democracy as about supporting workers' rights and economic change. Founded in September 1980, when delegates from 36 regional trade unions met in Gdansk and united under the name Solidarność, the group had become a legitimate opposition movement by 1981. Its membership had swelled to 10 million, a stunning achievement for an organization established only a few months earlier. With the imposition of martial law, solidarity was now in a struggle for its survival. Students and academics rose to the challenge. Sit-in strikes began in most universities. Protesters described martial law by invoking George Orwell's novel 1984 and Newspeak, the fictional language created by Orwell's totalitarian state of Oceania, to squelch freedom of thought. The strike committee at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Krakow noted, "For the third time during the 20th century, Poland is in captivity. The last 2 times were under a foreign occupier, but now we are faced with a self-occupation. Let us not be deceived. It is not important what language the occupier speaks, German, Russian, or Newspeak. What is important is how the occupier behaves. In the middle of Europe, in the late 20th century, 35 million people have been stripped of their fundamental civil rights." In Warsaw, television cameras captured images of the bright blue armored star vehicles from the dreaded ZOMO, Zmotoryzowane Obwoda Milicji Obywatelskiej, motorized reserves of the citizens' militia, halting in front of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Security officials marched inside the academy, hustled some of its distinguished members into the snow, and stuffed them inside the vehicles. Labor unions across the country responded with unblinking resistance. In Gdansk, the gates of the Lenin shipyard were decked with flowers as hymn-singing crowds gathered before them. "Members of Solidarity, compatriots," the Solidarity branch at Ursus appealed in a statement rushed to the media. "The purpose of this attack is to liquidate our union. Our answer must be, in accordance with the statutes, an immediate general strike in the whole country." Back at Camp David, Reagan was apoplectic. The week before, CIA officials had briefed him that martial law was possible, but unlikely. They had been wrong. Reagan viewed Solidarity as one of Eastern Europe's most promising democratic movements, and was indignant that the Soviets were trying to eliminate it. After a flurry of phone calls from Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Vice President George H.W. Bush, and CIA Director Bill Casey, Reagan dashed back to Washington in the early afternoon of Sunday, December 13th. At 3 p.m., he met with his national security team at the White House. "Something must be done," he said emphatically. "We need to hit them hard and save Solidarity." The stakes were high. The imposition of martial law in Poland was, by far, the most significant crisis of Reagan's fledgling presidency. As Secretary of State Al Haig wrote to Reagan in almost Machiavellian terms, the crisis in Poland had massive implications for the U.S.-Soviet struggle. The importance of Poland's peaceful revolution is hard to exaggerate. It weakens the Soviet Union and strengthens us on many fronts. It was also a watershed for Reagan himself. U.S. government officials had already discussed allowing the CIA to provide covert assistance to Solidarity. But there was little consensus, since some officials in the State Department and White House were alarmed that U.S. aid to an opposition group behind the Iron Curtain was unnecessarily provocative. The situation was different now. In late December 1981, after a National Security Council meeting to debate U.S. policy options, Reagan wrote in his diary, "I took a stand that this may be the last chance in our lifetime to see a change in the Soviet Empire's colonial policy regarding Eastern Europe. We should take a stand and tell them unless and until martial law is lifted in Poland, the prisoners were released, and negotiations resumed between Wałęsa and the Polish government, we would quarantine the Soviets and Poland with no trade or communications across their borders." Reagan viewed the Polish struggle in black and white. The Soviet government was evil, irreconcilably evil, and the United States needed an offensive strategy that went behind the Iron Curtain. Containment, the buzzword of the Cold War, was too static. It was time to adopt a more audacious strategy. Rollback. A free and democratic Poland could unhinge the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe, Reagan believed. Other states might follow. Later, he would say of the moment, "We were witnessing the first fraying of the Iron Curtain, a disenchantment with Soviet communism in Poland, not realizing then that it was a harbinger of great and historic events to come in Eastern Europe." He then added, "I wanted to be sure we did nothing to impede this process and everything we could to spur it along. This was what we had been waiting for since World War II. What was happening in Poland might spread like a contagion throughout Eastern Europe." Reagan acted deliberately. Over the next several months, he approved several national security decision directives, NSDDs, that authorized the United States to undermine Soviet control in Eastern Europe. One of the climactic decisions was to sign a presidential finding on November 4, 1982, which approved a CIA covert action program to provide money and other non-lethal assistance to Solidarity. The program was named QRHELPFUL. It was one of the CIA's most significant gambles of the Cold War, since it required the CIA to recruit assets, establish a covert network, and aid a resistance movement behind the Iron Curtain. As everyone involved realized, the program risked a confrontation with Moscow. This is the story of the CIA's effort to strike at the heart of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, as seen through some of its most important characters: Reagan, Solidarity leader Lech Wałęsa, Polish leader Wojciech Jaruzelski, and CIA officials like Bill Casey and Richard Dick Malzahn. For 35 years, the United States had conceded Eastern Europe to the Soviet sphere of influence. But Reagan wanted a clean break. With his support, the CIA built a program that took the Cold War to the Soviet Union's backyard. QRHELPFUL was one of the United States' most successful covert action programs, yet also one of its least known and appreciated. While Solidarity and the Polish people ultimately won their own freedom, CIA aid ensured that neither Jaruzelski nor the Soviet KGB, Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, Committee for State Security, could eviscerate the Polish opposition movement. The CIA provided money and resources to organize demonstrations, print opposition material, and conduct radio and video transmissions that boosted opposition support and morale, while simultaneously eroding Soviet authority. QRHELPFUL was also cost-effective. The total bill amounted to less than $20 million, or roughly $40 million in today's dollars. What made QRHELPFUL particularly effective, however, was that it aided a grassroots organization that was already legitimate among Poles. Within the United States, Reagan's decision to aid Solidarity was a political win-win. Liberals supported Solidarity because they were horrified by Warsaw and Moscow's suppression of a democratic opposition movement, one that was grounded in Poland's shipyards and mines, which appealed to left-leaning labor groups like the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO. Conservatives were incensed at the Communist Soviet Union's aid in suppressing Solidarity. The long, grinding patience of Reagan and the CIA helped Solidarity survive even the bleakest days of persecution. And when Solidarity's opportunity finally came, as the Soviet Union neared an economic and military precipice, the Polish people embraced democracy. Poland was, of course, not the only military or ideological battlefield between the United States and the Soviet Union. Another was Afghanistan. While the CIA provided money for equipment like fax machines and printing presses in Poland, the CIA's covert action program in Afghanistan, which had begun under President Jimmy Carter, combined both propaganda and weapons. The results became controversial, and the U.S. success was double-edged. The Soviet Union bled itself nearly to death in the land known today as the graveyard of empires. But awash in arms, some of which came from the CIA, Afghanistan deteriorated into a civil war in the 1990s. Several years later, the Taliban took advantage of the anarchy, established control, and granted safe haven to al-Qaeda. Then came September 11, 2001. There has been little written publicly about the CIA's covert action program in Poland. Most Reagan biographers and American historians assume Reagan's actions ended with economic sanctions. One of the best recent biographies of Reagan, H.W. Brand's Reagan, The Life, discussed the Reagan administration's policy decisions after martial law. In the end, Brands wrote, Reagan's substantive response to the martial law declaration didn't go beyond the sanctions measures he described in the Christmas speech. Those measures include the suspension of agricultural shipments, termination of U.S. credit insurance through the Export-Import Bank, and cancellation of landing privileges for Polish planes at American airports. The esteemed Polish historian Andrzej Paczkowski noted that the real facts behind outside assistance to Solidarity are still surrounded unaccountably by an aura of secrecy. Much of that mystery can now be revealed. A covert action relies on numerous documents that have been declassified over the past 2 decades from U.S. archives, including those available at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, National Security Archive, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and Hoover Institution, Polish archives, Soviet archives, and Churchill Archives Center, which house the Mitrokhin Archive. This evidence includes U.S., Soviet, and Polish transcripts, intelligence assessments, first-hand accounts, and secret records of meetings and conversations. The CIA Records Search Tool, crest at the National Security Archive, for example, includes situation reports, national intelligence daily briefs, information cables, special analyses, intelligence memoranda, and national
Sample complete. Ready to continue?